When Janet Williams arrived at her auto service, a mechanic mockingly suggested she pay for the repairs, as if she were buying a new car. Little did he know, his rudeness would turn into a catastrophe for him. How she responded will even surprise the most seasoned individuals. But let's start from the very beginning. Janet Williams, an African-American woman in a sharp business suit, stopped her sedan at the local auto service. The car rattled and vibrated as if it were ready to fall apart. At the gate stood the head mechanic, Joe, a tall, burly white man whose laughter echoed throughout the lot. He was joking with his colleagues about her car, calling it a metallic coffin, and didn't even try to hide his disdain. Janet stepped out of the car with a calm expression and walked straight to the counter. Joe, chewing on a toothpick, lazily approached her. "How can I help?" he asked with a mocking tone, clearly expecting to see a confused woman who didn't understand what was wrong with her car. "My car is making noise, and I'd like a diagnosis," Janet said, ignoring his sarcastic tone. Joe snorted. "Diagnosis? First, you need to earn enough for the repairs. People like you just want to save on us," he said, glancing at her old sedan. The mechanics behind him quietly chuckled. "Are you going to keep laughing, or are you actually going to do your job?" Janet asked coldly. Joe decided to prove his point. He waved at her car, suggesting she start it up. As soon as Janet turned on the ignition, Joe loudly declared, "Oh, this is going to be expensive. Maybe it would be easier for you to go buy a new car." His tone was as patronizing as his smirk. Janet didn't respond, just crossed her arms and watched him. It quickly became clear. Joe wasn't planning to actually help. Instead, he kept making belittling jokes, clearly not taking her seriously. "Maybe you should fix it first, then talk," Janet said calmly, her voice as firm as a hammer blow. For a moment, Joe fell silent, but he soon started laughing again, unaware that the situation was about to change. After Joe's mocking remarks, Janet remained calm, but her eyes revealed a cold resolve. "You're here to fix cars, not to judge people. Do the diagnosis," she said firmly, placing the keys on the counter. Joe shot her a disdainful glance, reluctantly took the keys, and headed for the car. Approaching the hood, he loudly announced so that everyone could hear, "I can't even imagine how this junk made it here. Most likely the repairs will cost you the price of a new car. Though from the looks of it, you've probably saved up for years just to afford this one." His words sparked more laughter from his colleagues. Janet clenched her lips but stayed silent, watching his every move. When Joe opened the hood, he began listing possible issues, most of which sounded made up. "Everything's shot here. The engine, the timing belt, the filters," he continued, pretending to seriously inspect the car. "But if you want, we can try to do something. For triple the price, of course." Janet, noticing he wasn't actually diagnosing the car, turned her attention to the adjacent bay, where another mechanic was working on an expensive SUV. She noticed that the bolts were incorrectly tightened and calmly said, "Looks like you made a mistake here. If you leave it like this, the tire might come off." Her voice was confident, causing the mechanics to exchange surprised glances. Joe, hearing this, laughed even louder. "Oh, so you're an expert now? Maybe you should start working here." Her colleagues smiled, but there was a hint of doubt in their eyes. The mistake Janet pointed out was real. One of the mechanics nervously walked over to check the bolts and quickly fixed the error. "All right, enough of this show," Joe snapped, raising his voice. "Either you wait while we evaluate this heap of metal, or you leave. I don't have time to listen to your theories." Janet stood her ground. "You've got not only rudeness, but your work is at 0 level. If you can't do your job, I'll talk to someone who can." The atmosphere grew quieter as employees exchanged glances, realizing that tensions were rising. No one suspected that the climax was near and that the roles were about to reverse. While Joe continued to blatantly ignore Janet's requests, a black SUV pulled up to the auto service. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. Tom Bryant, the regional manager of the auto service chain. Instantly, the staff quieted, and Joe tried to appear busy, though he couldn't suppress his mocking smirk. "Joe, What's going on here? Tom asked sternly, his gaze scanning the mechanics, who stepped back in silence. Janet took a step forward and calmly replied, I simply came to receive a service I'm willing to pay for. Instead, I was met with rudeness and a refusal to conduct the diagnosis. Tom furrowed his brow. Is that true? He asked, turning to Joe. Joe, hands in his pockets, smirked. No, it's just a regular customer with a problematic car. Nothing major. We were trying to explain that her repairs might be expensive. Expensive? Janet asked with a slight smile. Funny how you're so sure of that without even performing the diagnosis. You have a problem not only with professionalism, but with respect for your customers. Joe scoffed. Well, you know, some customers just don't get how this works. But before he could continue, Tom raised his hand, cutting him off. Do you realize who you're talking to? Tom asked. Joe froze, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly regained his composure. A customer who clearly wants to argue instead of listening to professionals. Tom shook his head. This customer, Joe, owns the entire chain of auto service centers, including this one. Shock rippled through the workshop. Joe froze, as if the ground had suddenly been pulled out from under him. What? He managed to say. My name is Janet Williams, she said coldly, meeting his gaze, and I see there are serious issues here with staff management and service quality. The mechanic stood frozen, afraid to even breathe. Joe, trying to salvage the situation, quickly spoke up. Miss Williams, this is just a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I can fix everything. Fix everything? Janet asked, her voice growing firmer. Start by apologizing. Not just to me, but to every customer you've possibly alienated with your behavior. Then we'll talk about your future here. Tom silently nodded in support. Joe stood there, pale, realizing that his confidence had just crumbled to dust. After Janet's words, the workshop fell into a tense silence. Joe tried to say something, but the words caught in his throat. All the staff's eyes were now fixed on him. His confidence had evaporated. I apologize, he mumbled, avoiding Janet's gaze. Louder, Janet said calmly, but firmly. Joe lifted his eyes, realizing he had no choice. I'm sorry for my behavior, Miss Williams, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Apology accepted, Janet responded. But that doesn't change the fact. Your job is about professionalism, not belittling customers. Tom, hold a meeting. I want to make sure everyone understands our standards, and not just in this service center, but across the entire network. Tom nodded. Understood. We'll start immediately. Janet looked around at the employees, who were now gazing at her with respect and even admiration. This place was built on trust. I will not allow anyone to destroy that reputation, she said. As she spoke, a young mechanic named Mike timidly raised his hand. Miss Williams, he began. I've seen how Joe treated other customers before, but I was too scared to say anything. Thank you for showing us how important this is. Janet smiled slightly. Real change begins with the little things. Your voice matters. Help each other. Support the customers. That's the essence of our work. For the next hour, Tom organized an impromptu meeting. Janet watched as the staff shared ideas on how to improve the service center's work. The atmosphere began to shift before her eyes. As she was leaving the workshop, Janet paused for a moment. Joe stood off to the side, watching the scene with slumped shoulders. Joe, she called. He lifted his head, his gaze a mixture of guilt and resignation. You have a chance to change your behavior if you're willing to work on yourself. Or we'll find those who can, Janet said firmly. Joe nodded. I understand. Thank you for the chance. A month later, Janet returned to the same service center. The atmosphere was completely different. Employees worked with enthusiasm, customers smiled, and the new lead mechanic greeted her with respect. Joe no longer worked there, but his example had become a lesson for the entire team. Janet, satisfied with the changes, drove away, knowing that her principles had helped make the place better.